My next door neighbour at the time was a sergeant at Frankston. I said to him I'd really like to write a story about a typical night shift. Just happened to be doing a night shift the night that Natalie Russell was murdered. Paul Denyer said that he was sexually abused by his brother. That's why he did it. I knew that I would have to really stretch my courage to approach the families. I didn't want to write the book without their permission and without their help. And I just say, tell me about your daughter, not her dying, but her living.
Her life.
That isn't something that a lot of people talk about. And I didn't want Natalie 17 to be her legacy. And that was, I think, made the book so rich, is that the focus was always on the victims. And I guess that was something I'm not trained as a writer. I guess that was just something that I intuitively did, that I wanted to give the girls a voice. Everything that I write about is awful. But what I'm looking for is not the awful and the horror. What I'm always looking for, even today, is...
Welcome back to the Out of Interest podcast. Those that are returning, thank you so much for tuning in again. Those that are new to our podcast, my name is Ali. I'll be your host for today. I'm joined by Mazza, like always. You've been on the suit lately, man. What's going on?
Oh, we're here in a work context, and I have to.
Do you allow that way? He's always in a
I have
suit
to
now.
pop into pods.
Oh,
every
I'm
now.
so casual, and he's in a suit. But anyways, today's episode, it's another first of its kind for our podcast, true crime. Right, I'm a big fan of true crime. My auntie is actually obsessed with true crime, and I always think people that are obsessed with true crime have some issues with them, right? But I'm gonna unpack that today with Mazza, with our new guest, Vikki Petraitis. Is that? Did I get it right?
Petraitis, yeah.
Petraitis, right? Welcome to the Out of Interest podcast. How are you this morning?
I'm excellent and a little bit wet because it's raining in
It's
Melbourne.
raining?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for your time. I know it's early in the morning. It's cold. It's wet, like you said, and you're giving your time to us. Really do appreciate it. I do want you to quickly introduce yourself, right? I've done a lot of research on you because it's a first for us, true crime. I had to do a lot of research for this one, right? I'm not too into true crime myself. I do love the topic. I love watching crime movies and TV shows and whatnot. But I would love for you to introduce yourself and I guess explain to us what made you get into it. What was that moment in life when you're like, I'm into true crime? Where did that come from?
Well, it's funny because I was a teacher for 31 years and I always wanted to be a writer. And I have a feeling that a writer is born. You just want to do it, right?
Okay.
Because when you think about it, I'd never met another writer until I became a writer. So that means they're rare. And I think that, excuse me, I think that it's a rare thing to want to sit down and write 100,000 words. No one wants to do that. And anyone that looks at us and says, you're crazy. So I think that you just have this innate desire to be a writer. And when you have that, and I had that from being really young, from the minute I discovered books and my prep teacher would read a chapter of Enid Blyton's Wishing Chair and I was mesmerised and wanted to write my own books from a very young age. And I think then it's just deciding about genre. So when I was in year 7 at my school library, I discovered Agatha Christie and read through every single one of the many that they had on the shelf. And so I wanted to write fiction, crime fiction. And when I sat down to do that in maybe when I was about 19 or 20, I realised that I had no idea why people committed crimes at all. And so I started to seek out true crime books because I figured, well, that's where I would find, why do people kill? Why don't people just get a divorce? Or why don't people just, I don't know, what Agatha Christie was really light on motive. She would just describe it as some people just don't have the brakes to put on the brakes. And that didn't help me as a budding fiction writer. So I bought a book called Myra Hindley, Inside the Mind of a Murderess. And I thought, this'll help me. And then, of course, once you read true crime, after reading fiction, true crime is so powerful because these are real people that have had real tragedy or loss or murder. And also Myra Hindley, of course, was the Moore murderer, part of the team with Ian Brady. And you just think, what? And then I guess it just became about finding out why. Why do people do this? And then that became, it's like, well, I'm fascinated with this, collected every true crime book that I could lay my hands on, and none of them were Melbourne-based. They were all from the UK and the US, where true crime was huge. And there was only a couple of Melbourne. In the end, there was, I think, Walsh Street, and Andrew Rule had written Cuckoo about Ray Edmonds, the Mr. Stinky rapist. And that was it. And I thought, I want to write something set in Melbourne. And it was just about then finding a case.
So how do you go about finding your cases? I know there's a few big ones that you did, but what's the thought process to pick those ones out?
I think when you want something bad enough, it comes to you.
Right.
And so I was looking for a case, and then this is a crazy story. It was at Teacher Professional Development, and they told the story of the Phillip Island murder. And they told it in the sense that they said they were introducing a program for kids who'd experienced divorce, and they reasoned that this program existed because kids, when parents divorce, they don't often talk to the kids about how it's affecting them. And as a teacher, I knew that. I knew that parents would come in and say, no, my child's fine. That we're getting divorced, but they're fine. And the kid would be quivering next to them going, they're not fine. But the intensity of divorce or separation is so huge that research had found that adults didn't focus so much on the kids because their own pain was so large. And so this program was literally to take kids out of class and that were experiencing a family separation and to say, are you okay? And it's not your fault. And so they told the story of Vivian and Beth and Fergus, and they said that the families, and to this day I don't know which one of the families, had funded this program or put money into the program, and they said Vivian was, and they didn't mention surnames, they said Vivian, her dad had left when she was 8, and then when her son had just turned 8, found out her husband was having an affair, and she snapped and killed the girlfriend and killed herself. And so this is why these programs are important. So I'm guessing all the other teachers were sitting there thinking, wow, that's a good program for kids. And I'm sitting there going, I have to write that book. And that's where I found it.
Interesting.
They come to you.
Yeah, they do. I don't consider myself to be a creative person. I think Ali's a lot more creative than I am. He's in marketing. And I've always marveled. I remember at school there were kids who were so good at fictional writing. They had an imagination and they could actually convert that imagination to words on a piece of paper. One of the books that I read time and again as a kid was obviously Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling. And you go through that journey of how you're able to imagine all these things and then document that and actually be able to narrate a story in such an intriguing manner that can sort of suck a reader in. And I've probably read the set probably 8-10 times, the whole thing. So you know the story, but you just love reading it time and again. As a young person growing up, was that always your fascination as well? The ability to tell stories, read stories, and when did it shift from being fictional? Because I think when you're young, fiction is what really appeals to you. It's that sort of, it's out of your normal realm of imagination and possibility, something fictional, to then say, okay, well, I want to write based on non-fiction.
Yeah, it's a really good question because I think we are very much predisposed to story, right? From the time we're little, I taught prep, and preps are really, really hard to manage. It's like playing whack-a-mole. You know that game where they pop up and they're just like trying to keep them all calm. But the minute that you say, does anyone want to hear a story? All of the little faces go, yes. Yeah. And it's like your soul or your spirit is very much about consuming story. And what I think people might not think about in true crime is that you're telling the quintessential story. So it's very much a narrative in the sense of you have, just like fiction, you have a villain and you have a protagonist and you have a hook that leads the reader into the story. So even though we are telling a story about something that really happened, we're using that narrative structure, and that's the power of it. So we have this inciting event, a murder might happen or a crime might happen, and then you've got the dogged pursuit of the detective. And really, I think in terms of engagement, it doesn't really matter to the reader whether it's true or whether it's fiction. It's still that same journey of discovery. And I think crime, fiction and true crime is all about justice too. That people don't read it because they think it's gory, but if you look at any of my books, the description of murder might be 1 or 2 pages and the rest of it is the dogged pursuit of the detective or it is the victim's family who says, I'm going to set up a victims of crime organisation to help people that they never have to go through what we went through, or to help them go through what they're going through. So it's all about, justice, but it's real. And I think that's what draws people in. And it's descriptive. So it has all of the same story elements that fiction has, but it's true. And that's where the power lies.
Yeah. You know, in your writings and all your study and your research, how much have you grown up almost like a fixation on understanding the mind of the murderer?
Yeah, I used to. When
Yeah.
I was a lot younger, I used to. You read all the books on serial killers and the triad of the bedwetting and the firelighting and the cruelty to animals, and you've got all of the knowledge. But I think years down the track, you know how the older you get, you're still really young. The older that you get, the less you know, and the less certain you become, because there's always something that challenges a belief. And I just think that some people have the capability, and luckily most don't. If they talk about, Paul Denyer said that he was sexually abused by his brother, and that's why he did it. Well, sexual abuse is 1 in 4. And so why don't we have 1 in 4 people becoming serial killers? So there's this element that, this variable that we don't understand, that means that one person out of hopefully hundreds of thousands will become a serial killer, and all of the other people with those variables won't. I just think some people are, some people have that capacity.
You touched on Paul Denyer. We'll lead on to that one, the Frankston Murders. I want to understand, when you went about writing that book, how do you gather the information? Are you like a self-proclaimed detective? Do you go talking to police, to him, to do you interview? How does that go about? Do you have are you even able to do that? What's the process in okay, I'm gonna write a book about this crime? How do you start? Do you need permission from the police? How does that all unpack all that for us? It's quite interesting.
In the olden days, in 1993 when this happened, you could do ride-alongs with police, or I could, because no one else was doing it. And they didn't have the media department. They didn't really have the gatekeepers. They had, I think it was called corporate policy planning and review. And so I was doing a night shift with the Frankston police for a book that I was writing after Phillip Island, and it was literally police stories. So I'd ring up the air wing and fly around Melbourne in the police helicopter and write a story about the work that the air wing did, and then I would go to the rape squad and interview people there, and then I'd write a story about a typical kind of investigation that they would do. And so my next door neighbour at the time was a sergeant at Frankston. And so I said to him, I'd really like to write a story about a typical night shift, because I lived in Seaford at the time, and you live in these areas and you have no idea. You're in bed at 9 o'clock, or I'm writing usually into the night, but you're not out on the streets. And so to see the area that I lived in from the back of a police car was mind-blowing. That, when all the pubs shut at 3 o'clock and all the warring football barrackers for one team and barrackers for another team would just fight in the street. It was crazy. And so I got to see that, and I just happened to be doing a night shift the night that Natalie Russell was murdered. And I think because it was my next door neighbour, he said, you've got signed permission to be here. If it was anyone else, we would just send you home. But, because he knew me, his kid babysat my kid, and, our families were friends, and he said, just sit in the back seat. And of course I couldn't get out at the crime scene. And so I ended up just in the back of a police car for I don't know how long, for hours, while they were all out securing perimeters and searching and guarding the crime scene. And I'm just taking notes about how this offender had slipped through a net of 200 extra police in Frankston, and thinking he's out there somewhere. And so feeling those feelings and thinking, I have to write this book. I have to write it because I'm here, and I have to write it because I live in the area, and my my safety and my security had been compromised like everybody else. And so I also knew that up until then I'd interviewed mainly police, and I knew that I would have to really stretch my courage to approach the families, because I knew that I didn't want to write the book without their permission and without their help. And so in the olden days before email and internet, I wrote them letters and found them in the phone book and just reached out to them and said, look, I really want to do this. If I gain an interview with you, I will give you the chapter to read so that you won't be surprised about, you can read the whole thing. I was always very open about that. And so I got to meet the families and I spent really lovely time with all of them, because I think what people don't imagine is that they think of that journalist picture of the journalist sort of knocking on the door and what they don't really imagine is that when I come along, and I didn't write it until after the case had gone to court, so it was a year after. And in the meantime, I'd done lots of research. But when I come along and I just say, tell me about your daughter, not her dying, but her living.
Her life, yeah.
And that isn't something that a lot of people talk about, because their death becomes their
They're known by that.
story. Yeah. You know, Natalie Russell, 17, third victim of Paul Denyer. And I didn't want Natalie 17 to be her legacy. I wanted people to know who she was and what she wanted to be. Because to know what he took from us, you need to know the girls. And so luckily I was able to spend a lot of time with Natalie's family. Elizabeth Stevens was living with her aunt and uncle. I spent time with them. And I often relate a funny story. Elizabeth's uncle Paul was happy to talk and wanted to talk and was angry about what had happened and wanted the story to be out there. And her Aunt Rita said, nope, it's too painful, I'm not talking. And so Paul and I were sitting in their dining room with a cup of coffee, and every time he would answer a question, he'd say, oh, you know, Liz moved in with us in February. You'd hear this voice from the kitchen. No, it wasn't. It was January. And so in the end, she sort of stormed in and went, no, I want to talk now. And so she sat down and we had the most, and it sounds counterintuitive, but we had the most amazing discussion about Liz and who she was, and she painted her room and she used to play with the dog and she pushed her uncle in the pool. And it felt like in those conversations that she was alive, because we weren't talking about those final 30 minutes of her life. We were talking about her actual life. And that was, I think, made the book so rich, is that the focus was always on the victims. And I guess that was something, I'm not trained as a writer. I guess that was just something that I intuitively did, that I wanted to give the girls a voice.
You've spoken about meeting the families of the victims. Have you ever met any of the actual criminals themselves? Did you ever go out to jail to meet these guys, or have you ever been out to see them in their element?
Yeah, I wrote to Denyer in prison when he first went in, and I said, you know, I'm writing this book. Do you want to? I didn't really want to talk to him because I didn't want to represent his side of the story, because it's unrepresentable. But I also had his confession tapes, which are chilling. There was about 9 hours of his confession tapes, which the police had given me. I had a copy of the complete homicide brief, which was, I think from memory, about 9 folders. Wow. And once I got permission to write the book, the police gave me, in those days, I don't know that it would happen today, but they gave me this huge homicide brief, and I think it was 900 pages. It was massive. And so I had all the statements, all the witnesses, his transcript of his interview. I had the tapes of his interview. I had his reenactment tapes. So I had access to all of that. So I had him telling his story, and I didn't want him to minimise it. I didn't want him to justify it, because you can't justify what he did. So he didn't answer my letter in the end, and one of the detectives had spoken to him, and he said, did you get the letter? And he goes, I flushed it down the toilet. And I think he intimated to the detective that if he didn't help, the book couldn't be written. And I guess that's the psychopath in him. It's like, it's not about you. It is about the community. It is about the girls. It is about the cops. It is about the SES people that searched the crime scenes and found your knives. It's not about you. And in his arrogance, I think he felt it was. So anyway, the book was written. When we did the 25th anniversary edition, I wrote to him again because I always have to ask. And I got a letter from him, and that was a little surprising. But the letter, if you didn't know it was from a serial killer, you would just think this was a normal letter. But it's chilling in the sense that he said, how can you write the update of my life story when my life isn't over? Thinking that's a clever question, and it's not. And then he said, I won't help you with your book because I intend to write my own true and unbiased account of what happened that will be sensitive to all concerned. So if you want to know what a psychopath is, that's it. Someone who thinks that they could write their own account of murders that would be sensitive to the family of the people affected.
That would be unbiased.
That would be unbiased.
So my dad's an ex-cop, and one thing he'd always say, you probably said it to you as well, is that criminals always say that they're right.
Right.
No matter what they do, they could rape, they could kill a newborn child, but they will always have a justification of why they've done it.
Yeah.
And he's like, in the 2-3 years he was a police, he's like, every criminal says exactly the same thing. And he seems like another douchebag that thinks
I
he's
guess
right.
Even if they're caught in the act, right? You're caught
There's a
red-handed.
justification.
You were there for that reason.
Can you share with us the story? Like, what's this Frankston Murders about? For the listeners that don't know what this story is, can you quickly explain to us what this guy did, why he did it, and then we'll start unpacking a bit more, I guess.
So in 1993, in June, Paul Denyer murdered his first victim that we know of, Elizabeth Stevens. And Elizabeth was getting off the bus in Langwarrin, and he had picked a rainy night to target her, and he put a fake gun in her side, sort of grabbed her and said, I've got a gun. If you don't come with me quietly, I'm going to shoot you. And Elizabeth was 18, and she went with him, and he took her around to Lloyd Park in Langwarrin, and he killed her, and he carved a strange crisscross pattern in her torso. And so the murder was really brutal, and her body was found the next day, and the police were at a complete loss to know who would target her. So Elizabeth had only been in Melbourne for a couple of months, and she had moved from Tasmania, so she hadn't really developed a friendship group. She didn't have a boyfriend. She didn't really know anyone. She had started studying at the local TAFE in Frankston, and that's why she was catching the bus home from the library, and they had no idea how she came to be dead in Lloyd Park or who could have done it. And then a couple of weeks later in early July, the second victim, Debbie Freem, who just had a baby, I think little Jake was about 12 days old, and she goes up to the milk bar to get milk and leaves the baby at home with a friend who'd come round for dinner to look at the baby. And the milk bar's in the street that she lives in, so I'll just duck up to the shops and get some milk, and she doesn't come home. And it turned out that Denyer had climbed into the back seat of her car when she went into the milk bar, and when she got out, he again had used the fake gun. It was like this wooden block that he'd fashioned into a gun shape, and said, drive or I'll shoot you. And he directed her to Taylor's Road right at the back of kind of Carrum Downs, and he killed her. So the police had these two female victims of a similar age, both with stab wounds, with throat injuries that killed them, and some of them thought that it was a serial killer and some didn't, and they were investigated separately anyway just in case they weren't connected. But because Frankston had had a spate of murders in the 80s, that the newspapers jumped on it, and it's corridor of death and, people living in fear, and the newspapers, really the headlines were serial killer. And I interviewed a man called Claude Minesini who'd trained with John Douglas at the FBI Academy at Quantico, the behavioural science unit, and he'd done the profiling course. And he had no doubt. He said, you've got women who were snatched at random. You have things like strangulation was used as a form of control, but not to kill. And so there was some kind of rope or a tie to go around the neck, but it was to maybe subdue them, and then the other injuries killed them. So he saw patterns that were really, really interesting and came up with a map of where the offender might live, and which turned out to be really accurate. But of course it doesn't help in the finding of him, but it helps in understanding these kind of offenders. And so in the meantime, there was such a huge fear in the community that the police sent in 200 extra cops. They were door knocking, cops were everywhere. And there were so many that on the day that Natalie died, which was at the end of July, this all happens in a 7-week period, Paul Denya's car was checked twice that day. So once at the Flora and Fauna Reserve and then once on Sky Road, right opposite the bike track where she walked down on her way home from school. And there was something about him and also something about the fear in the community that a postal worker was riding her little motorbike along the footpath and she noticed him crouching down in the car, and there was something about him that she's gone, that guy looks really creepy. So she had gone and knocked on the door of a house a bit further down and said, can I use your phone to ring the police? And so by the time the police got there, he was gone, the car was still there, and he was killing Natalie down the bike track when the police were checking his car. And so when her body was found, she was just walking home from school at 2:30 in the afternoon. And when her body was found on the bike track, the 2 cops that checked the car went to the bosses and went, we were just checking a car of a suspicious guy in the afternoon. And so here's the details of the car. And so the police were knocking on his door that day, the day after he killed Natalie. And they took him into custody or took him to the police station, and he hasn't had a minute's freedom since.
Yeah.
So that's how they caught him.
From your research, I'm assuming you researched Paul Denya quite a bit as well. Did he have like a reason to do it? Like what was his issue? Was it just he just wanted to kill someone random? Did they how did that go about according to your researching?
He talked about, in his interview, he said, I've wanted to kill since I was 14.
Right.
And the development of serial killers in some of the research that I've read, it does start sort of at puberty, that instead of developing into a normal, what is normal? I don't know what normal is, but you know what I mean. A regular person, he's developing the desire to kill, and that's taking over all of his thoughts. He talked about the fact that he killed because his brother had sexually abused him. The police didn't really ask him in detail about that, but they did say, well, why women? And he goes, just hate them. And so how he got to be the killer of women after being sexually abused by his brother, that's his allegation, I don't know. But it triggered something in him that made him a killer. But he was very dedicated to killing. And I think that is a feature of a serial killer too, that all of their mindset is around killing. And there's one bit in his interview where he's walking police through his house and he points to a broken tracksuit. You know, the tracksuits have the tie around the middle? Yeah. And he said, oh, that broke off from my tracksuit, so I kept it for strangling. And then he kept walking, and I thought, this is the difference. This is what he's showing us he is, that if our tracksuit tie broke, we might say, oh, I'll keep that to tie the tomatoes or I'll keep it for whatever. We wouldn't go, oh, I'll just keep that for killing. And so this was indicative of his mindset, that everything that he did was very, very focused on, oh, I'll make a weapon for killing, I'll plan killing, I will stalk women, everything that I do in my day is all about the stalking of women to kill.
Did he ever explain why he picked them?
He said they were random.
Okay.
I wonder about that because a couple of weeks before she was murdered, Elizabeth Stevens had come flying in from the bus stop and said to her uncle, "Someone was following me," and he's gone outside. He was a tough guy. Like he he wasn't one to shirk from maybe, what, oh, go out on the
Yeah.
street and I'll find them. And so she felt that she had been followed. Now, when I talked to Danya's family, and I spent a lot of time with his sister-in-law and his brother, and it turned out that the house that Elizabeth Stevens lived in was a house that Paul had been to a lot, and his brother's girlfriend used to live in that exact house. Now, is it a coincidence that Elizabeth was followed, and is it a coincidence that she was then murdered? It's a big bloody coincidence, isn't it? The same house, right? Melissa Denya, his sister-in-law, had just had a baby, and then he targets Debbie Freem, who's just had a baby. And the same night that he'd targeted Debbie, he'd tried to snatch a woman in Seaford, so again, catching the train down. And he had tried to grab her, and she bore a strong resemblance in age and appearance to his mother. And so, and then Natalie Russell was a schoolgirl called Natalie. His sister was a schoolgirl called Natalie. Is there a coincidence? I don't know. It could have been completely random, but serial killers will often target representations of women who they feel have wronged them or symbolically killing people in their lives. And the women that he targeted seemed to be very much representative of women in his life. So is it random? He said it was. The police didn't care whether it was or it wasn't because it's their job to catch him, get a confession and a conviction and put him away. So they're not psychologists wanting to write his life story or wanting to find out. It's their job to get him off the streets. So the writer has a very different function to police and the courts. And I don't know, I just noticed these patterns and thought, could they be not coincidences?
Seems like he was getting revenge for
Yeah, something.
something deep down that had hurt him earlier on in life, and he's like, "Well, I'm going to try to right the wrongs," I guess, in a weird way. When you study the lives of serial killers and their behavior and anything else like that, do you feel that, again, not from a police or detective perspective, but for yourself as a writer or as somebody who studies this, would you be able to profile, preemptively somebody who said, look, you know what, there is a higher statistical probability of somebody becoming the next Paul if they have these attributes or this history or this background from a behavioral perspective?
Yeah, I think if you read John Douglas's book and Robert Ressler's book, Whoever Fights Monsters, there's a whole lot of experts that were really pioneers in this field as the advent of the serial killer was becoming a thing, because it didn't used to be a thing. And so certainly they are incredibly effective at looking at people. But I think this is so rare. One thing that writing crime has taught me is that the chances of it happening are really rare. So even though I lived in the area when this was happening, I wasn't afraid because I could see the patterns of what he'd done, and he wasn't breaking into houses and he wasn't targeting people in groups and he wasn't. So I kind of figured as a citizen of the area that if I would go shopping at night, but I would walk in at the front of the shops and it was always lit and I wasn't walking in dark places. And I kind of figured that those patterns made it safe for people inside their houses. But of course that was incorrect because he had broken into several houses. But we didn't know that until afterwards because the police hadn't connected that until he confessed to breaking into a neighbour's house and killing her cats really savagely. And the police hadn't connected that to him. I think now they would have. I think now we know a lot more about cruelty to animals, and that crime was something that the police that investigated it had never seen anything like it. Like a cat and two kittens had been killed and their throats had been cut, and he had written in blood on the wall, "Donna, you're dead." And this was a woman that he knew, and who liked him, would have coffee with her, and he targeted her house and said if she had been home, he would have killed her. So that was worrying. And he'd also broken into, we found out later, he lived in this block of 4 units on Frankston Dandenong Road, and the first one he broke into was his next door neighbour, and stabbed all of her clothing and her bedding and her engagement dress, and carved messages into her furniture. And she said to the police, "I think it's Paul next door," and they didn't do anything about it.
Really?
And according to Donna's mum, their family said to the police, "We think it was Paul that did it." And the police just said, this is their story. They said, the police said, "Oh, we can't just go knocking on doors accusing people." It's like, I thought that's what police did. Thought that was the thing. Anyway, so what I think that did inadvertently was when women are saying, "I think it's him. I think it's the guy next door," and nothing happened. I think he is like a prize fighter cracking his knuckles saying, "I can do this and no one will come after me." And I think he felt like he was, like a god walking through, choosing who lived and who died. So can you pick it? I think we're a lot better in this day and age at picking red flags in people, but I think we need to be more worried about family violence, the statistics on that. I think I read like one every 11 minutes an ambulance is called in Australia for family violence. So I think we should be much more worried about what is giving, largely men are the perpetrators, what is happening in society that is giving men the message that they need power and control over women. That's way more worrying than serial killers, and way more prominent in society. So I think it's all connected.
Yeah, I'd love to understand how you were when you were researching, especially the Frankston murders, like mentally. Did it affect you in any way? Did you have nights where you were just crying? Does it still haunt you till this day? Because I'm sure you've seen and experienced and heard things that the public hasn't. I would assume so. So is there like a situation that you came across that has really affected you throughout, your research of this case?
Yeah, I don't get affected. I think that if you did, you couldn't do this kind of work.
Right.
And to me, it's always about the power of the story. So that if I'm sitting with family and they're telling, they're crying, and I feel like they are honouring me with the story of their loved one, and my responsibility to write that story in a way that honours that victim is all-encompassing. And so there was no time to say, "Oh, that's awful," even though it is. Everything that I write about is awful. But what I'm looking for is not the awful and the horror. What I'm always looking for, even today, is the strength that flows from adversity. This is what fiction is all about, right? You love Harry Potter. If you dug down, you'd go, "I love him because in every scene he gets knocked down and he gets back up again."
Resilience.
Every scene. And if Harry Potter was about a boy who was famous and he went to wizard school and he got straight A's and became head boy, we wouldn't have read
Boring.
the 7 books, would we?
True.
We read it because J.K. Rowling is really mean to him, because this is what makes a hero, right? None of us become stronger when things go right. Our strength and our learning comes from when things go wrong. So a lot of people in everyday life, when not a lot goes wrong, they'll go, "Oh, this thing happened, what bad luck." But I don't look at it like that. I look at it as in, if something goes wrong in my life, my first default reaction is, what can I learn from this? What can this teach me? How can this make me more understanding, more powerful, more empathetic? How can this change me? Because we are formed by what happens to us, right? So when I write crime, I am looking for these golden nuggets of wisdom and learning that come from adversity. And that's what keeps me going back. So just to get completely off topic from Frankston, we spent a couple of days last year with 2 people connected to the Link Cafe siege, and one was a hostage, Louisa Hope, who is the most awesome person I've ever met. And the other was the tactical operations unit operative who shot the terrorist. And Louisa, so she was really badly injured and she was a hostage right to the very end when the shootout happened. And her grace was extraordinary. And so while the interview was about, oh my goodness, what happened? Like what did you experience inside of that cafe? Because we were all at the outside, weren't we? We were all watching on the outside and watching those guys with the guns and that siege that went for so long. But what was that like for a woman who, you know, was inside of it? And she was so extraordinary that we could have sat there for hours, and at one point she stopped and went, am I talking too much? And all of us, the three of us, and we went, no. Keep going. Like, don't. Just the story was incredible. And she talked with such compassion and such beauty about what she had learnt from being in that situation. And it was awe-inspiring. So really what I try and do is I try and tell these stories of people who have been through this, and it's like, how did you survive and thrive? And so hopefully the listener will say, well, if Louisa can be a hostage with her mother at Lint and be there till the bitter end and witness the killing of Tori Johnson and Katrina Dawson, and come out of that thinking, how can I be a better person? How can I be stronger? What can I learn from it? How can I connect and share this story? Then people might say, well, you know, I couldn't find a car park at my local shops. If Louisa can get through that, I can get through having to walk a bit further in the rain. Do you know what I mean? So I think that's what I look for, because we see it in fiction and we accept it in fiction, but it is true in life as well.
Vikki, I want to give you a bit of context to something before I ask you a question. So I don't think I've spoken about this before in our podcast, but I've been to jail. I used to be a prison chaplain, so I used to go out and meet criminals, murderers, etc., etc. And I was engaged by the Islamic Council of Victoria to deal with, you know, Muslim inmates across maximum security and juvie and everything in between. And when I got offered the position, I jumped at it right away because of the fascination with, okay, this is the closest that I'll come to a criminal. Hopefully I don't do anything more than that. But interacting with these, you know, men, and you see huge guys, burly, you know, pretty scary fellas. But some of them have been are serving multiple life sentences and this and that. So you get to, and I did this over a number of years, so you get to know some of these guys reasonably well. And they talk a lot about how regretful they are and how remorseful they are and all that. And it sort of brings to mind the notion of, people say you should hate the crime, not the criminal, right? So I'm keen to get your perspective on that, to say, okay, well, you've studied serial killers, you've analyzed their behavior, you've written their stories. Well, what's your perspective on that? How much of this can be rehabilitated out of a person? Because right, with these days we have all these correctional rehabilitation programs, get them, you know, re-assimilated back into society. Is it once a criminal, always a criminal? Or is it, or are there types of criminals that you feel, or types of underlying behavioral characteristics that can be reframed, and some that are just innate, and that, look, no matter what you do, this person will always return to a life of crime?
Oh, that's such a big question, isn't it? I was really careful when we were campaigning to get the law changed to keep Paul Denyer in prison forever, because he did get a life sentence, never to be released. He appealed. He got a 30-year minimum, which was up last year, and he was applying for parole. He is an ongoing danger forever. And I think we have to be really careful, because when people started to talk about him and keeping him in jail, and it's like everyone should stay in jail, so we were really careful to say Paul Denyer is one out of the box. He is an offender that is unlike any other offender. Is he capable of empathy? Is he capable of understanding the, you know, the victims what he took. He's not. He really isn't. So in terms of rehabilitation, he cannot ever be changed because of he's a psychopath. And I think that when we talk about all the other criminals that aren't Paul Denyer, I think sometimes you can do, like in Harry Potter, an unspeakable, that, I think it's the unspeakable curse or the unforgivable curse or whatever. And I think that you can do an unforgivable thing. And I think that if you kill 3 women, or if you're an offender like Robert Farquharson, or if you're an offender like Ray Edmonds, that there are people in there that do these unforgivable things that as a society we say they give up their right to ever be part of society again. We deserve to be protected from them. I have no doubt that Paul Denyer would kill again. But I think for other people, I think they can show remorse and they can learn, because this is what hardship is all about and this is what life is all about. But I guess the question is, do you want to live next door to them?
Not really.
And that's a problem because, someone that says, well, I've served my time and I'm better. And I guess one really good example is Craig Minogue, the Russell Street bomber. So he was 23. He set a bomb in the heart of Melbourne and then laughed with great delight when they parked a little bit further away and it went off. He didn't know who was going to be walking past. I've interviewed one of the guys that was walking past that was really severely injured, Carl Donadio. I had taken kids on school excursions and lined up in that exact spot where that bomb went off, and there could have been a class of kids. He didn't care. And so he's now, hey, I was 23 then, now I've done a doctorate. I deserve to be out in society. And I think he has people supporting that. But the thing is, what if you took his car park? Can he manage that anger? Can he manage that sense of entitlement that I get to set a bomb because I've got feelings of revenge? Does that go away? And I think quite rightly the government has said, you're not getting out, buddy. That's it for you. You're not getting out. You do that, it's unforgivable. And also we don't trust you that you wouldn't do it again.
Yeah.
He also killed someone in prison. Quite horrendously, but it's like, how many chances do you get to live among regular law-abiding people? And so can people be rehabilitated? I think when you were talking before about your dad concluding that a lot of criminals feel like it was their fault and that they were pushed to it, and I've read that in research around family violence too, that when the offenders are spoken to, it's like, she pushed me. I wouldn't have done it if she hadn't have. And there's no personal responsibility taken. And if you can't take responsibility for what you do, then you're not safe to be out, because your actions are your responsibility and they're no one else's fault. And so if you don't have that in your mindset, you're not safe, I guess. I mean, you would know more than me because you've had that experience. Do you think that they can change?
I subscribe to your view that it comes down to, I think, what they're guilty of, and I guess the circumstances around that as well. I think for petty-ish crimes or whatever they are, they can, that's fine. But if somebody, because I don't know, for me, like murdering somebody that's the limit. You cannot be worse than someone who could take somebody else's life. And
There are worse than that.
Yeah,
Rape's a big one.
Yeah, of course.
I sometimes feel like rape is worse than murder.
Worse than murder.
Because that person's living with that for the rest of their life.
Yeah.
And again, everyone has
But so then that's the thing. Like if you're able to do that, then there's nothing that says that, okay, well, if you've served your time and been rehabilitated and gone through all the different processes that they have, it's still and whoever it is that has to make that decision to say, okay, well, hey, you are by legal decree now able to walk among citizens. That's a big burden to carry, because if that person reoffends, that's entirely on you. That next person's life that's been taken, that sits squarely with you, buddy. And that's not.
It's a hard one because, again, we're taking the blame. If you say the parole board lets someone out because they have fulfilled the legislative requirements, and then that person commits another crime, like Adrian Bailey, for example, with Jill Maher, that it's that's the fault of the parole board. But you go, well, actually, we need to put the blame on Adrian Bailey.
Of course.
Do you know what I mean? Because I think in our society we have to foster personal responsibility, and this is what we don't do. We don't name offenders. We don't, and until Jane Gilmore wrote her book Fixed It, which was fixing headlines that never ever mentioned perpetrators. Woman attacked in taxi rape. The taxi didn't rape the woman. A man did, but there's no man in the title. And it became such a huge problem. And because Jane Gilmore started the Fixed It, and she would just cross out taxi rape and write, woman attacked by taxi driver in, she would just fix the headlines to reflect the fact that a man is doing this. And we don't, as a society, we go, oh, not all men, and we have this pushback. But if we don't see the problem and we don't say, it's a big problem, if it's 1 in 4, if every 11 minutes there's an ambulance being called, we have a national crisis that up until really, really recently we were not addressing or even mentioning. I did this as a lesson with some kids, right? So I got just random headlines in one day. And so there was one headline that said, murder suicide dad, good bloke, says mate. So a man who had killed his 2 little toddlers and then shot himself and fallen off a pier or whatever, good bloke. And then there was another one that said, love triangle to blame for restaurant stabbing. And then you read the story. It was a woman who divorced a really, really violent husband who had stalked her for years. She had gone on her first date ever since the divorce and the AVOs out on him at a cafe in broad daylight with a guy that she'd never met before. The stalking husband is caught on CCTV walking across the restaurant, stabs the man to death, stabs the wife. She doesn't die. So this random guy who's never met the woman before, and the headline says love triangle to blame.
Yeah, it's watered down.
But there's no love triangle. Violent man to blame, violent man stalker to blame. And then there was another headline, and I gave these to the kids and they had a really interesting reaction. These were Year 10, it was a Year 10 ethics class. The other one was, mother drops baby. And then in smaller letters, when stabbed by armed intruder. So ladies, when you're stabbed, be careful not to drop the baby because that will be the clickbait. And one of the Year 10 boys said, I said, do you see anything wrong with this headline? Hoping that they would go, that's just plain wrong and horrible. And he goes, no, nothing wrong with that. It's clickbait. Make me click on it. I do Year 10 boy really well, don't I? I do a really good imitation. And I was amazed that these kids probably had never thought about headlines and had never thought about the representation of offenders and victims. And this has probably predated Jane Gilmore's Fixed It, but I was always very aware of how the media portrays violence against women and how if we don't address it, we're all unsafe and all the women in our families are unsafe.
I do agree. But my next question is going to be something more recent. I would love your input on it. I'd like to see, your thought process on it. It's the recent assassination attempt on Trump, right? A lot of people saying, yeah, he deserves dying. A lot of people are like, what the hell's wrong with this kid? Why is he assassinating a former president? And like I said, a lot of people think he should die, right? Is there ever justification to kill someone? Or what are your views on that assassination attempt? What could you say was going through this kid's mind? I know it's a political thing. Would love your input in it.
My first reaction when that happened was I thought this is going to give him a lot of sympathy. Mm-hmm. And I think as a woman, looking at anything about Trump and particularly his boasting about sex offending, and I think for me what was really interesting was that it didn't change people's minds. And he said, I think one of his quotes was, I could walk down Main Street shooting people and it wouldn't affect my rating. And that is really worrying as a human. So take the politics out of it. It's really worrying when a man can boast about minimising the impact of sexual assault on women and you can just grab them and because you're famous it won't matter. And I feel like that didn't matter to voters, and that was really concerning. I think that gun violence is something in America that America will never get rid of, because constitutionally it's more important to have the right to bear arms than it is to protect their citizens. So they will take as a cost of the right to bear arms that they have. I think it's now weekly attacks, shootings in
In
schools.
schools. Oh, it's
Yeah.
ridiculous.
It's a
Like they're
lot.
just so common, they're not even reported.
Mm.
So if you think the right to bear arms is more important than the life and safety of your 5-year-old, I don't understand that. And I think in Australia we don't understand that because it's nuts. And so where a young man who has access to high-powered weaponry can climb up on the roof and try and attack a president and pay with his life, as I'm sure he knew he would have, because you're going to get shot. And I find that that's probably a really typical American thing, isn't it? That you can become famous by doing that. His name and picture will be on the front page of every newspaper around the world for doing that. And he'll pay with his life, but the prize will be fame. And were we surprised that it happened? Well, not really, because America is such the political climate there is so heated. A friend of mine lives in America and says you just don't mention it because people will pull out guns, and that's a whole other problem. Just as an aside, I did see Hillary Clinton when she came to Melbourne and did the interview with Julia Gillard, and I was in the audience, and Hillary said something really interesting. She said when she was a president's wife and served, her approval rating was, I think it was 67% from memory. And she said when she was Secretary of State, her approval rating was the same. And when she served on the Senate, her approval rating was high. And she said the minute that she put her hand up and said, I want to rule, I want to lead, her approval rating plummeted. And so that, again, is we let women serve, but do we let them lead? And we ended up with Trump because we didn't want a woman. And the whole narrative around Hillary before the election, and this is a narrative we have to be really careful of, is woman as liar. So this kind of echo when Hillary's a liar, she lied about her emails, she's a liar. And every time I hear that narrative, I go, what do they want you not to look at? Because she checked her emails on her BlackBerry and not her official computer. We got Trump for president. Amber Heard's a liar. She lied about which makeup she used to cover the bruises that she said was caused by family violence. Meghan Markle's a liar. So every time we have woman as liar, Brittany Higgins is a liar. And of course, it was proven in court, suggested in court, that she was not a liar. But what are they asking us not to look at when they have this woman as liar narrative that runs through? Because it's the worst thing we can accuse a woman of. And this is why rape cases, the conviction rates are in the single digits. She must be lying.
Yeah,
I see where you're
it
coming
brings into
from.
question their credibility and says, okay, well, whatever they say, whatever they do, it can be questioned because their credibility is shot.
I heard a quote that said, when we believe women, everything has to change. When we believe the man, nothing has to change.
Never heard that one before.
Yeah,
I
It's
see
the
where, I
path
see where
of
it's coming
least
from.
Yeah.
resistance, isn't it?
that's true.
Yeah.
There's-
It's such a broad, like this is all connected, right? This is all connected in terms of, the Frankston serial killer, crimes against women, not believing women, it's all connected. But my book, because I wrote a novel for my PhD in creative writing, and it's called The Unbelieved, because the title is about when we don't believe women, we make the world unsafe for all women. And so that's kind of the message that I want to push in a lot of the work that I do.
Like even when Jill Mart got killed, it was like, why is she walking alone at that time?
Yeah.
Right? Like she became, like it was like her
She's
fault.
the reason why
She's
it
the
happened.
reason why
she
it
was asking
happened.
for it.
Yeah.
Right? So
It's
it's,
crazy.
it's
And
very
no
unfortunate.
one asked,
Yeah.
why is he out there killing her?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's very unfortunate. I do have another question because you touched on how the person that tried to assassinate Trump, getting fame. And I feel like that's becoming more of an issue now. Criminals are getting more and more famous. Like, I'll give you an example of Jeffrey Dahmer. Netflix made a show of him, and people started dressing as Jeffrey Dahmer for Halloween. Or people making jokes about it, but not in a hateful way, but in an encouraging way for Jeffrey Dahmer. So they're normalizing criminals and not making it look very bad, right? Do you see this becoming a big issue? Like, TikTok's another platform, right? When a criminal, like even the person that tried to assassinate Trump, people are making memes out of it, and not in a very lightful, funny way.
There's a doc on Aaron Hernandez as well, you know, from the NFL. This guy's big name, drafted, this and that, huge name in the US. And then there's this whole story about what he did. And there are people out there who are like, oh, yeah.
Like
Celebrate
they
it in a
become
way.
famous, and they water it down like it's not a problem. Do you see this going to
I
be
think
more?
when it involves sporting people and famous people, and I think Johnny Depp, that trial, you know,
Yeah.
but we love him, we love his movies, so he can't possibly have done anything wrong. You know, there's a flaw in that kind of logic, and I think people don't like change, and they don't like to be confronted with, but how could I like him if he's bad, so therefore he mustn't be bad because I like him. And there's a twisted kind of logic. I think people that ever have experienced crime would never do that. I see on social media people will say, if you could have dinner with any serial killer, who would it be?
Yeah.
And my response to that would always be, not that I'd ever write on those platforms, but it would be, if you could have dinner with someone who's a family member, that's where you get the truth, and that's where you get the real story. And if you did have dinner with someone who had been affected by a serial killer, you would never, ever think it would be cool to have dinner with a serial killer.
It's true.
If you really knew what they took. And I am in the privileged position to spend time with people who do know what it's like firsthand to lose a family member to that kind of violence. And you would never, ever glorify the killer if you had any exposure to that. And I think you touched on it before when you said true crime is entertainment. I think that some people do, but the creators of it, like me and Casefile, who I work for, we would never, ever, we do it for purpose. Like, I created the Frankston Murders podcast because we targeted that to be released right before he could apply for parole. We wanted maximum exposure about his story, and we wanted the world to be reminded of what he did. So, as a really powerful tool in the quest to keep him in jail, I did Phillip Island because it's a story that doesn't have an ending, and we wanted to try and get more information coming forward about that case. I did the podcast series on Sarah McDermott because I know her parents and they are beautiful people, and I said to them, let's give this one more push to see if we can try and find out what happened to Sarah. So I'm not sitting down going, wow, I really want to entertain people. I'm sitting down creating podcasts thinking I need to change things, I need to solve things. It's a purpose. And Casefile and my podcast will never ever have any kind of banter or joking, or because what we're doing, the topics aren't served by that in the way that we want to do it. And I'm not criticising people who have banter on their true crime podcasts, but I would make the decision not to do that. Just like when I wrote my novel, I made a decision that I have a female detective, that she is not going to get injured, because I'd read too many novels where the female protagonist gets blown up and run over and shot at and punched in the face. And I was just like, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that to my female character. I'm not going to use her as a punching bag, because I think that contributes a bit to the kind of violence that you're trying to speak out against. And so, they're just sort of personal things. But to me, it's not entertainment. And I don't think the bulk of the audience listen to it as entertainment. I think they listen as participants. So when The Teacher's Pet came out, people were marching for Lynette. They were wanting to get a GoFundMe to buy the house that she used to live in, to dig up the soft soil in case she was buried there. They're activists. And I think this is what true crime does, is you do listen as a participant, not as an observer. And I think the kind of true crime that we are really dedicated to making is telling really heartfelt stories, and having people at the end of the podcast come out of it a bit more educated about something.
One last question, Vicky, before we wrap up, real quickly. I would love to know if there's like a crime story that you'd really make a book about. Which one would it be? It could be in Australia, it could be anywhere in the world. Which one would you love to make a novel about?
Look, I would really love to have written one on the mushroom case. I think that's really fascinating. And I think Erin Patterson, what I found fascinating about the media coverage of it is that they immediately were very happy to do woman is poisoner, woman is multiple killer, woman is... And I thought, and the kind of concurrently we were getting the Bruce Lerman trial, and people were twisting themselves into pretzel shapes to say innocent till proven guilty, and he probably didn't do it. And I, as a crime writer, I'm going, yeah, he probably did, because, statistically, 1 in 4. But we were really, really reluctant to say Bruce Lerman, who took money for his story and who just behaved in a way that certainly had red flags for me. And a judge concluded that he did do it. But why were we so reluctant to, as a society, to go, yeah, he probably did do it? And yet along comes a female alleged poisoner, and we're really, really quick as a society to talk about how guilty she must be. And I worry about that. What was it about her that we could just pounce on her and sort of declare her in all of our conversations to be guilty? And if she is guilty, I would love to know what pushed her to that very, very extreme action.
That would be a great one. That would be a great one. But
I think there'll be a lot of books on
No,
that.
yeah.
I think authors will be elbowing each other out of the way for
100%.
that one. Yeah.
There's a lot of I don't even know how to word it. Like, there's a lot of good stories you could... I don't even know how to word it without sounding like an idiot. But there's a lot of crimes out there that you could create some good books on. But
the good ones are the ones that no one knows about.
yeah,
So
100%.
I'm listening to the Hedley Thomas's podcast Bronwyn at the moment. So a woman disappears 30 years ago and she's not reported missing, and all of her friends are like, she never would have left her kids. And then it takes Hedley Thomas to come along and say, well, maybe did anyone look at the husband? And he had a history of violence and it wasn't a healthy relationship, and she's trying to leave and she disappears. And then no one looked at that. And I think as a true crime writer, I've always wanted to do these cases like Phillip Island that aren't on the radar at all. I think they're the important ones, because how many people out there like Bronwyn's friends are out there saying, well, our friend disappeared or our sister disappeared and the police didn't investigate it and they didn't look at it, and they believed the husband or they believed the story of someone who could be the perpetrator. And so it's shining a light on ones that don't have a light shone on it. They're the ones that I'm really interested in.
It's far more unique and niche, I guess, from the end sort of audience perspective as well. You're like, well, I haven't heard of that one before. Let me look into that. Whereas everything else has been reported on far and wide. You're like, okay, well, I know the particulars. This will probably make it more dramatized, but I already know what's going to happen. Whereas, I see where you're coming from.
Yeah. And on that note, we'll leave it over here. Vicky, thank you so much. It's been very, very insightful. It's a very different podcast for us.
Yeah.
Very, very different. And the way you explain it, it's very calming. It's very calming. And I would think that your books are like that as well, in a very calming and professional manner. So thank you so much for your time. And we wish you the best in all your endeavors. Maybe one day one of your books will become like a feature movie or TV show on Stan, or probably be Stan because it's more Australian focused.
Yeah, that's into focus.
But looking forward to for your future books.
Thank you for having me. It's been lovely chatting.
Thank you.
Hope you guys all enjoyed it. If you guys did, give us a like, subscribe. Look into Vicky's books. They're amazing. I've been researching it. I do intend to look at it more and more, but I'm not much of a book reader, Vicky. But I'm more of I like watching.
Audiobooks.
Audio.
Give me an audiobook.
But until next one, guys, take care of yourselves and look after yourselves. Thank you very much.